History is littered with all kinds of nasty engagements, horror stories in the wake of war, and the usual toe-curling tales of human suffering. But what many of us haven't heard of, including myself, this video is actually a recommendation for one of our subscribers, is the Siege of Suiyang, in which, and I'm not exaggerating, up to 30,000 civilians were devoured in a desperate bid for survival. It might well be the largest ever act of cannibalism in human history. And the funny thing is, in the story we're covering today, that's somehow one of the less interesting details. Honestly, medieval Chinese history goes pretty hard. So, in this video we're going to be looking at how the Siege of Suiyang started and how it all went down. Our story begins in medieval China, around the year 755 AD, with a man named An Lushan. Lushan was one of the commanders of the military forces of the Tang dynasty. His Sogdian and Turkic heritage made him an outsider, yet he rose to command over 160,000 troops in the northeast, despite originally being of Gurk or Sogdian origin, somewhere between modern-day Persia and Central Asia. And Lushan had managed to get in close with the Tang dynasty's imperial court, located in Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, somewhere in the central north of China. At its height, the Tang dynasty was absolutely enormous, stretching nearly all the way into Uzbekistan to the west, Vietnam to the south, and almost to Korea in the northeast. Some 80 million people found themselves living within the borders of the Tang dynasty, which was also home to countless different ethnic groups. You can think of Christianity, Islam, Chinese folk religion, Taoism, Buddhism, even Zoroastrianism. All of these people, all of these cultures, all of the land and wealth within this empire was ruled by one man, Emperor Xuanzong. His reign, once a golden age of prosperity, had grown complacent, riddled with corruption under Chief Minister Li Linfu. I might have butchered the pronunciation there, and now is a good time to say, there's probably going to be some brutal pronunciation fumbles in this video. It is what it is. I don't speak Chinese. Sorry. Anyway, as you can imagine, this military commander in Lushan is looking at all this land and wealth and power and prestige, and eventually thinks maybe instead of just being a sword for the Tang Empire, he could overthrow the emperor himself, and then become the new ruler. His rivalry with Yang Guozhong, the emperor's cousin and a power-hungry politician, fueled court suspicions against him. At least, that's what he's accused of, and eventually these accusations start to threaten his life, and he's forced to either fight and possibly survive and take over the Tang dynasty, or, let the accusations settle in, and then he'll be put to death for sedition. Fearing execution after false charges of treason, he decided to strike first. And so, on the 16th of December in the year 755, An Lushan marched his army from the city of Fanyang, sparking a civil war in China, which would kill millions of people and absolutely devastate the internal economy and landmass, and all the rest of it. The An Lushan Rebellion, as it's known, claimed up to 36 million lives, a sixth of the global population. This war also managed to last the reign of 3 different Tang emperors, who would fight for their lives, as they tried to hold on to the Tang dynasty that was being torn apart from within by An Lushan and his Yen Rebellion. Things started off pretty well for Lushan. He got in some quick military successes, and by January of 756, less than a month after the outbreak of the war, he was able to defeat the Tang general Fang Changqing and capture the Tang city of Luoyang. He proclaimed himself emperor of the Great Yang dynasty on February 5, 756, a bold challenge to Tang rule. He then has some difficulties around the spring of 756. But they're not enough to hold him back, and by the summer of that same year, he's managed to muscle his way into the Tang capital of Chang'an, which was a massive win for Lushan and his Yan Rebellion. On the other hand, the Tang Emperor Xuanzong was completely thrown out of whack by this, and was forced to flee Chang'an and then escape down to Sichuan, where he could regroup and plan his next move. Unfortunately, however, Emperor Xuanzong and his entourage came into some issues on the march, in which his bodyguards ended up getting into an argument with the emperor's advisor Yang Guozhong. We're not sure what started the argument, but things got so heated that the bodyguards eventually killed Yang Guozhong and his entire family, including Yang Guifei, who happened to also be the emperor's lover, and it's recorded that she eventually succumbed to strangling. Her death, immortalized in Baijui's poem, Everlasting Remorse, became a symbol of the Tang's collapse. Emperor Xuanzong realized that if his own bodyguards were willing to kill his lover and chief advisor over a simple roadside argument, then it's probably a matter of time until he's next, and so he better start planning an exit strategy. Racked by guilt and fear, he saw no choice but to step down, and so, once he arrived in Sichuan, he immediately abdicated the throne in favor of a new leader, his son, Emperor Suzong. And so, when you add it all up, in less than a year, An Lushan and the Yan Rebellion had managed to capture the Tang imperial capital and force the ruling emperor to abdicate, which is not bad work. But this luck more or less ends here, and now I need you to bear with me, because this all gets a bit mental now. So basically, there's a Christian organization in China at the time called the Nestorian Church of the East. They actually found their way into the East by originally trying to smuggle Chinese silkworms back to the West so they could make silk there instead of buying it from the Chinese. But anyway, while they were there, they started preaching, and they just stuck around. Led by priest Alopen, they gained favor by translating Christian texts into Chinese. The reason I bring them up is because the leader of this Christian organization, a priest named Yi of Balkh, who's from somewhere like modern-day Iran, decides he's going to back the new Tang Emperor Suzong, who took over after his father Huanzong's humiliating abdication in Sichuan. They back Suzong in exchange for more freedoms to spread their Christian faith in China, promising military support through their ties to Central allies. And Suzong actually sets up similar deals with a lot of other esoteric religions in China at the time, including a large Buddhist sect led by Amoghavajra, who invoked the deity Akala against the rebels. And so, the Christian priest, Yi of Balkh, ends up taking personal command of a Tang army, and with the help of another Tang general, Guozi, they're able to stop the Yan Rebellion in their tracks and start turning back the tide on the war. Their victories at Ye and Shihe in 757 crippled Yan's supply lines. But while the Tang dynasty start to find their footing and strength, An Lushan and his Yan dynasty start to find themselves on the back foot. It doesn't help that, since the outbreak of the war, An Lushan's health has started to decline massively. Although he'd always struggled with his eyesight, historians estimate that somewhere in the months immediately following the capture of Chang, An Lushan starts to go permanently blind. Chronic skin ulcers and diabetes exacerbated his condition, making him volatile. This blindness had also started to make him really paranoid, as he felt unable to read the room or see anyone's true intentions or motivations during political discussions and negotiations, and this led to him becoming prone to tantrums and outbursts. He executed subordinates on whims, alienating his own generals, and so he actually spent most of his time alone and away from court life. He'd also become ridiculously obese, with historian Zhao Hui writing of an event in which he once tried to mount a horse, but his sheer weight was enough to actually kill the steed beneath him. He would even require 3 servants to dress and undress his enormous body, and during temper tantrums, he was prone to strike them if they displeased him in any way. His paranoia drove him to whip his son, an Yingshu, sparking resentment. Needless to say, this man, now severely impaired both mentally and physically, was not the ruler the Yan dynasty needed if they were going to successfully prosecute their war against the Tang. So, it was time for An Lushan to go. An Lushan had actually named one of his sons, an Exongsu, to be successor, but his younger son, an Exongsu, wanted the throne, fueled by years of abuse and ambition. And so, a conspiracy between King Shu and the emperor's advisors was hatched. They were going to stab him in his sleep. The emperor's advisors had been more than happy to go along with this plan, since Cheng Shu was by far and away the best chance the Yan Rebellion had of going toe-to-toe with the Tang dynasty. Chief advisor Yan Zhuang, fearing Qing Xu's competence, orchestrated the plot. And so, on the 29th of January, a eunuch named Li Zhuer snuck into the bedchamber of the sleeping Lushan and tried to do him in with a sword. But despite his failing health, Lushan was able to put up a decent fight, and a scuffle ensued. Lushan managed to push back the armed Li Zhuer and buy himself just enough time to reach under his bed and grab a sword that he had placed there just in case this kind of situation ever arose. But unfortunately for Lushan, his eyesight prevented him from finding the sword, and while he was fumbling around with one arm under his bed, Li Zhuer was able to collect himself and run his blade through the Mad King's stomach. Li Zhuer withdrew the sword from Lushan's stomach and then fled the palace. As Lushan's intestines were leaving his body, he uttered his last words, "This is a thief of my own household." He died unaware that his son had betrayed him, believing a mere servant had struck. Lushan had no idea that this was one of his most trusted advisors, and he'd imagined that the man who just broke into the Yan Emperor's palace and murdered him was nothing more than a petty thief. That's how far he'd managed to lose touch with reality. Anyway, with An Lushan gone, the door was opened for Qingzu, who quickly proclaimed himself emperor of the Yang dynasty and got to work. He promoted loyal generals to quell dissent, but his introversion weakened his rule. But he had an immediate problem to deal with. About a week before An Lushan was murdered, the Tang forces had begun to fortify their positions in the lands around the Yangtze River. This was a vital strategic asset for both sides. Whoever held the Yangtze would have the food, manpower, resources, and logistical structure to realistically end the war. Right now, the Tang had it, and King Zhu wanted to change that. Luckily, however, King Zhu had been getting encouraging reports that the Tang-held city of Suiyang, a pivotal city hanging on the east side of the Yangtze Basin, was left more or less undefended. Located on the Grand Canal, Suiyang was a choke point for Yang supply routes. If the Yang forces could take this city, they could use it as a foothold to press west and push the Tang out of the Yangtze altogether. It was a no-brainer. And so Qingzu ordered some 130,000 troops, led by 2 generals, to march down into the area around Suiyang and siege the city. General Yin Ziqi, a seasoned Yang commander, led the assault with Yang Chaozong. It was the right choice. When the troops arrived in Suiyang sometime in late January, they realized that the city was being held by a tiny garrison of less than 10,000 men. Under Zhuang's administration, only 6,800 defenders, including Zhang Shun's 3,000 volunteers, stood firm. Of course, a siege of any kind almost always involves an attacking force which outnumbers the defenders, but these odds were over 10-1. So you can imagine the Yan forces feeling pretty confident they'll be able to take the city with minimal effort. But oh boy, they were wrong. The defenders of the city, who were led by a man named Zhang Shun, recognized the strategic importance of holding on to it, and so promised each other that they would defend the city to the last man, no matter what it would take. Zhang, a former magistrate turned deputy Jaidushi of Henan, was renowned for his tactical genius at Yangqiu. They would keep this city out of the hands of the Yan Rebellion, and they definitely lived up to their promise. Zhang was a master tactician, and his plan for victory was to play every card he possibly could, to dig in his heels and try and even the odds. He leveraged his reputation as a loyalist icon to inspire unwavering resolve. One of his tactics included playing battle drums every single night, even if the Yan besiegers had launched an attack that day. Battle drums were a way to get your soldiers psyched up for a fight, and so if you heard your enemy playing their battle drums, it gave you a kind of cue to prepare that something was going to happen. So Yan soldiers, after hearing these drums, were forced night after night to get up and prepare for a fight that would never come, losing sleep and, most importantly, patience. After some time of this, the Yang soldiers began to get a bit lazy, and they wouldn't bother to react to the drums by standing watch or getting into their armor. And it was at this point that Zhang Sun ordered some of his cavalry and mounted archers to sally out of the city gates and attack the sleeping, unarmored Yang forces, who were ignoring their battle drums. It was an extremely successful tactic, and the Yan lost 5,000 men in one night. This raid disrupted Yan morale, already fragile from internal divisions. On another occasion, Zhang figured that he might be able to force a Yang retreat if he could break their morale, and he thought the best way to do this would be to strike their general with an arrow, essentially decapitating the 130,000 Yang army. The problem was that Zhang Sun didn't know what the Yan general Yin Zi looked like, nor did he know whereabouts in the army he would actually be, and so he employed his tactical genius again by getting the Yan soldiers to show him. He ordered his own soldiers to shoot weeds from their bows rather than arrows. These weeds can still hurt someone in the right circumstances, but they're obviously nowhere near as devastating as a properly made arrow. But when the Yang soldiers noticed that the archers were not pelting them with arrows, but in fact just weeds, they immediately ran to the general Yin Ziqi to report that the Tang defenders must have run out of arrows, and that the siege must be coming to a close. Zhang Xun, of course, who had plenty of arrows, watched with glee as the Yan soldiers unknowingly gave away their general's position, and then ordered his best archer, a man named Nan Jiyun, to ambush the general's position, successfully striking him in the eye with an arrow and throwing the Yan forces into chaos. The arrow hitting Yin's left eye caused a near mutiny among his troops. Yin Ziqi had managed to survive the arrow and paid for the mistake with his eye. He was still, however, able to see that his own attacking army was on the verge of a mutiny. In just 16 days of siege, some 20,000 of his men had died outside the walls of Suiyang, and he himself was grievously injured. It didn't look good. He figured he would retreat north, regroup, and return to resume the siege once he had his army back in proper fighting order. The retreat cost Yin another 10,000 men, to desertion. It should have been a death blow to the Yan ambition on the city. You see, typically when you break a siege, you give the defender time to restock their supplies and reinforce the soldiers behind the wall, meaning that returning for a second siege is almost impossible, because the defenders are better prepared than ever before. Fortune, however, would have other plans. Upon hearing that General Zhang Shun had successfully broken the siege of Suiyang, the Tang district governor became nervous that the Yang forces might try their luck elsewhere, since, as we said, trying a siege in the same place twice is a recipe for almost certain failure. Fearing Yang attacks on nearby Kaifeng, the governor acted rashly. And so, in preparation for another siege on a nearby stronghold, the Tang governor ordered Zhang Xun to share his stockpiles of food with neighboring cities, so that they had a fighting chance against the Yan horde. Zhang Xun, who was forced to share his food and supplies, was not prepared for a second siege, but that's exactly what happened. The Tang's refusal to reinforce Suiyang left Zhang isolated, a decision historians still debate. We're not sure why they chose to go a second time. It's possible the Yang had guessed this move. They might have just been stubborn, or Yin Ziqi sought revenge for his lost eye. They might have been motivated by a personal grudge after Ziqi had lost his eye to Zhang. But whatever the case might be, they decided that they were going to have another stab in the Yangtze region, and they set their sights on Suiyang for a second try. After about 2 months after the original siege, sometime in the spring of 757, Yin Ziqi was once again outside the city walls of Suiyang, but this time the siege wouldn't last 16 days. It would drag on for months, while the defenders inside had to make do with reduced manpower and virtually no food or supplies. We don't know much about the opening months of the siege, but by July, Tang soldiers had a miserably low ration of rice on which to sustain themselves, so they turned instead to local animals, insects, and roots, whatever they could find that they could eat. By August, limited rations had turned into a full-blown famine, and it didn't take long for the Yan forces to figure this out. When one of the defenders was killed on the city walls and fell down into the hands of the Yang soldiers, they cut him open to inspect his stomach. Upon seeing no rice and no other traces of a typical meal, they were able to conclude they must have been reduced to scavenging. Zhang Xun, the commander who had led them to such a miraculous victory during the first siege, now found himself trying to lead his men through a situation which was hopeless. 10,000 defenders had been whittled down to around 1,600, and most of them still standing were either sick or starving. Disease spread rapidly, with many soldiers too weak to stand guard. All of the insects, animals, roots, anything edible inside the city basically was already gone, and as you can imagine, the situation was dire. Zhang Xun ordered the archer Nan Jiyun and 30 men to break out from the siege and request help from the neighboring Tang forces, but they all declined him. In one instance, Nan petitioned the governor of nearby Linwei, Helan Jinming, to march to the aid of Suiyang. Helen, however, had a personal grudge with Zhang Xun, possibly feeling overshadowed by his military prowess, and so he declined to intervene in Suiyang. But, in a gesture of good faith, offered Nan Jiyun and his men a table at that evening's feast. Depending on the source you read, Jun responded by either cutting off or biting off his own finger, and then placing it on the table of Helan before saying, "How can I eat such a large feast when I know what my comrades are facing? Although I failed my mission, I will leave a finger with you as evidence that I did come here." He spat in disgust, vowing vengeance if he survived. He then left. But he made a promise to everyone present that if he managed to return from Suiyang alive, he would kill Helan, and shot an arrow into a statue of a Buddha as a demonstration of his resolve. However, a governor present at the meeting, Lian Ju, was impressed with Jiyun and decided to give him 3,000 soldiers as a gesture of encouragement. Jiyun rode back to Suiyang with these men, but only about 1,000 of them were able to get through the Yan lines and into the city. Their arrival briefly raised hopes, but the reinforcements were too few to turn the tide. Although this was still more than enough to effectively double Jiyun's forces, the Tang forces may have had more defenders now, but this also meant they had more mouths to feed, and the famine continued to sink its claws into the starving defenders. Once again, Zhang Xun was surrounded by his soldiers begging him to do something about the food situation before they starved to death. What happens next is pretty bizarre. Zhang Xun figured he could win a quick morale victory with his soldiers, and fetched one of his concubines and dragged her in front of his soldiers. He then killed her in full view of the men, and threw her body to them, saying, "Brothers, for the sake of your country, you have defended this city with united efforts. I'm not able to cut my own flesh to feed you, but how can I take pity on this woman and just sit by and watch the danger?" He claimed her sacrifice would honor their loyalty to the Tang. Understandably, this sight made the soldiers quite upset, and they are reported to have cried and even shouted in anger at Zhang Xun over the whole thing. But he just batted these protests off and told his men to stop being a bunch of cowards, and then forced them to eat her. Despite their initial reluctance, the men did eat, and this set a dangerous precedent that defenders began to use as a solution to the hunger situation, but by sacrificing the innocent civilians within the city walls so they could fill their stomachs and fight on. Zhang Xun justified it as a necessary evil to protect the Yangtze Basin. What's more, there's an order they used to protect the Yangtze Basin. What's more, there's an order they used to protect the Yangtze Basin. The historical sources, including the New Book of Tang, detail a kind of hierarchy that they used to categorize who's fair game and who gets to stay alive. Unmarried women such as concubines were the first to go, and then elderly women and girls would be next. After that, old men and young boys are next on the chopping board, and finally, if need be, they're allowed to sacrifice fighting-age men in order to eat. This systematic approach, overseen by Zhang, horrified even loyal soldiers. This went on for months, and by the time Suiyang finally fell to the Yan forces on the 24th of November, only 400 people inside the city remained alive, all of which were soldiers. The civilian population, estimated at 30,000, was entirely consumed. Now, 30,000 civilians is a lot of people, and that number threw me. So we're actually going to do a little bit of math together about cannibalism, and figure out if we can rely on that number. An average adult human body weighs about 60 kg. We're being generous here, considering that the people of the time were a bit smaller and, not to mention, they were all starved by this point. Now, approximating about 10 to 15 kg of fat and 15 kg of muscle protein each, we can break down the calories each person could provide. Fat provides approximately 9 calories per gram, while protein provides about 4. That means that the fat alone from a single body could yield about 135,000 calories, and the protein bringing another 36,000, bringing a total caloric value of a human person to roughly 170,000 calories. But we've got 1,600 soldiers remaining in the city, which means, if you total that all up, they all need about 4 million calories between them. That meant they'd need to kill, at bare minimum, 235 people per day to get the energy they need to keep fighting. And remember, we're being conservative with our estimate here. And that's, of course, assuming perfect rationing, which obviously wasn't the case. That 30,000 figure now suddenly doesn't seem anywhere near as outlandish as it did before. And of course, having to resort to cannibalism was about as soul-destroying on the men as you'd expect. Many chose to stay starving at first, but the hunger eventually caught up with them. Plus, at this point, when everyone else was doing it, it probably felt a bit normalized, though some soldiers wept as they ate, tormented by guilt. And so, even if you're very, very principled, you're also very, very hungry, and probably being encouraged to eat. Despite this, the men were still wasting away, as they were eating little more than the bare minimum. And now, on top of all that, they were sick, restless, mentally broken considering, the cannibalism they'd been doing. But Zhang Shun tried to keep everyone in line, ruthlessly enforcing discipline to prevent collapse. And there was just no stopping the hunger and trauma from breaking them down bit by bit. And so, Zhang Shun eventually was forced to surrender, although he himself, along with about 30 loyal soldiers, absolutely refused to pay the appropriate lip service and personally surrender to the Yan forces, and so they were killed. Yin Ziqi, despite admiring Zhang's resolve, executed him to prevent a mutiny, fearing his loyalty would inspire rebellion. But everyone else, those other 370 or so men, we think they survived, we're not too sure. One nasty bit of irony is just 3 days after Zhang Zung's surrender, the Tang reinforcements would arrive. But of course by then, it was far too late. A Tang army of 50,000 retook Suiyang in 4 days, a bitter victory. Among those who died would also be Nan Jiyun, who was now unable to keep his promise to kill the Tang governor He Lan, who had snubbed his request for assistance just weeks before. His death, alongside Zhang's, cemented their legend as martyrs. But the crazy thing about the Siege of Suiyang is that this is just a tiny part of an enormous historical event kicked into motion by our unlovable firestarter, An Lushan. This entire period is in fact named after him, called now the An Lushan Rebellion. In Steven Pinker's book The Better Angels of Our Nature, he puts the death toll of the An Lushan Rebellion at 36 million dead, about 1/6 of humanity's entire population, or roughly the whole population of Europe at the time. The war's devastation weakened the Tang, ushering in warlordism for centuries. Unthinkable loss. Anyway guys, if you enjoyed this, don't forget to let me know in the comments. This is a suggested video from one of our subscribers, Yarrick Style. If you've got something you want us to cover, you can always ask. I've been Jake, this has been Flashback. Give us a sub, all that stuff. Bye bye, big love.